Today we're going to be looking at In Favor of the Federal Constitution by James Madison. Here we're going to learn a little bit about James Madison. James Madison was a Virginian who was deeply involved in the early writing of American government. He contributed to the Virginia Constitution and was an active participant in the Constitutional Convention. On June 6, 1788, Madison gave a speech refuting Patrick Henry's argument against giving additional powers to the federal government. Henry supported the revision of the Articles of the Confederation. Madison supported the federal Constitution. Madison's speech answered many of the fears of the anti-federalists and helped to secure favorable opinion for the federal Constitution. Madison went on to contribute to the Bill of Rights as well, and he became known as the father of the Constitution. In 1808, Madison was elected president, from which position he led the United States into the War of 1812. All right, so we know that James Madison was one of basically the founding fathers. We're seeing here that he has great experience in regards to the beginning of the federal government. We have a date here that we might want to remember as important. So he gave a speech refuting Patrick Henry's argument against giving additional powers to the federal government. So if he was refuting his argument against giving additional powers, then that means Madison was for giving additional powers to the federal government. So Madison supported a federal constitution. It answers fears of the anti-federalists and secured a favorable opinion. So that means in this speech, we're going to see how he addressed the fears of the people who were not feeling what he was thinking, and show how he changed their minds, turned it over to a favorable opinion. So let's dive in. We ought, sir, to examine the Constitution on its own merits solely. Okay, so he's addressing a sir or a group of people, and he's saying, let's examine the Constitution. So he's just talking about the Constitution. He wants it to be examined on its own merits solely. So we're just looking at the Constitution. We are to inquire whether it will promote the public happiness. Its aptitude to produce this desirable object ought to be the exclusive subject of our present researches. So they're inquiring, they're investigating whether it being the Constitution, will promote public happiness. So that is the goal, public happiness. Its aptitude, or its ability, it being the Constitution, its ability to produce this desirable effect. The desirable effect is what? Public happiness. Ought to be the exclusive subject of our present researches. So that is exclusively what we're looking at, whether the Constitution can promote public happiness. That's what we're researching right now. That alone. In this pursuit, we ought not to address our arguments to the feelings and passions, but to those understandings and judgments which were selected by the people of this country to decide this great question by a calm and rational investigation. So basically he's saying, let's not get all emotional. Let's not turn to our feelings and passions. Let's be rational and calm. Let's look at the understandings and judgments which were selected by the people of this country to decide great questions. Okay, so he's appealing to take on a rational method of looking at this, not an emotional method. I hope that gentlemen, in displaying their abilities on this occasion, instead of giving opinions and making assertions, will consent to prove and demonstrate by a fair and regular discussion. So basically he's saying, again, let's not just use opinions, let's not make assertions, let's use proof. Let's demonstrate with a fair and regular discussion. It gives me pain to hear gentlemen continually distorting the natural construction of language, for it is sufficient if any human production can stand a fair discussion. So in other words, he's saying it really bothers him. It really bothers him when he sees people using the language and distorting it to say something that it's not actually saying, because it's sufficient to stand a fair discussion. Before I proceed to make some additions to the reasons which I have been adduced by my honorable friend over the way, I must take the liberty to make some observations on what was said by another gentleman. So basically he's saying, before I share my opinions, I want to address some observations I've made in the argument that was made by another gentleman, which we can assume is Patrick Henry in his argument. He told us that this Constitution ought to be rejected because it endangered the public liberty, in his opinion, in many instances. So basically the final summation of what Patrick Henry said was it should be rejected because it endangered public liberty, public freedom. So give me leave to make answer to that observation. Let the dangers which the system is supposed to be replete with be clearly pointed out. If any dangerous and unnecessary powers be given to the general legislature, let them be plainly demonstrated, and let us not rest satisfied with general assertions of danger without examination. So essentially he's saying, let the dangers, let's point them out, clearly point them out. If any dangerous and unnecessary powers be given, let them be plainly demonstrated. So he's like, show me, essentially. Show me where these dangers are listed. I haven't seen any proof. He's wanting proof. If powers be necessary, apparent danger is not a sufficient reason against conceding them. He has suggested that licentiousness has seldom produced the loss of liberty, but that the tyranny of rulers has almost always affected it. So licentiousness is a word we're not used to saying. So I looked it up. It means lacking in moral restraint, ignoring accepted rules or standards. So he has suggested that ignoring the rules or lacking moral restraint has seldom produced the loss of liberty. So it's not so much, he says that it's not so much people with bad morals that produce the loss of liberty, but that the tyranny of rulers has always affected it. So he's saying it's not really lack of morals, it's tyranny that's always affected liberty or power, I guess, and therefore the liberty of people. Since the general civilization of mankind, I believe there are more instances of the abridgment, which means condensing, the abridgment of the freedom of people by gradual and silent encroachments of those power than by violent and sudden usurpations. I'm not sure if I'm saying that, but usurpations means unlawful taking. So basically he's saying that he sees more instances of freedoms being taken away by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power. People doing little subtle things to increase their power than by violent and sudden taking of power. But on a candid examination of history, we shall find that turbulence, violence, and abuse of power by the majority trampling on the rights of the minority have produced factions and commotions which, in republics, have more frequently than any other cause produced despotism. And that is the rule by absolute power or tyranny. It's another word for tyranny. So what he's saying on this, if we look at history, we see that turbulence, violence, abuse of power, the majority trampling on the rights of the minority, that has produced fractions and commotions, which in republics, he's saying in republics here, this type of government, have more frequently than any other cause produced tyranny. That's what that word means. If we go over the whole of history of ancient and modern republics, we shall find their destruction to have generally resulted from those causes. If we consider the peculiar situation of the United States and what are the sources of that diversity of sentiment which pervades its inhabitants, we shall find great danger to fear that the same causes may terminate here in the same fatal effects which they produced in those republics. So he's saying if we consider the peculiar situation of the United States and the sentiment that pervades its inhabitants, we can see that there's a danger that the same causes that produce tyranny in the study of ancient and modern republics could be produced in our same government. This danger ought to be wisely guarded against. All right. So the first note that we can see, the first thing he addressed, that was the apparent danger. There was this apparent danger. And so he argued against that, saying the more danger is not just in, the danger is more in the silent encroachments of power and these commotions that can result in tyranny in republics. That's actually where there's danger, not in the power of the federal government. So he addressed that first issue that he felt that Patrick Henry said, which was an apparent danger. So now we're going to move on to this next paragraph. I must confess, I have not been able to find his usual consistency in the gentleman's argument on this occasion. So first off, he's kind of given a little slam, right? He's like, I don't see the normal consistency in his argument. He informs us that the people of the country are at perfect repose. That is, every man enjoys the fruits of his labor peaceably and securely, and that everything is in perfect tranquility and safety. So repose may be an unfamiliar word. It's usually a word used to describe like when you're relaxing. So basically he's saying here that Patrick Henry has said, everybody's very happy, everybody's peaceful, everybody's enjoying the fruits of their labor, everything's fine, everything's wonderful. And he says, I wish sincerely that this were true. If this be their happy situation, why has every state acknowledged the contrary? So apparently every state has said, we are having a hard time. Why were deputies from all the states sent to the General Convention? Why have complaints of national and individual distresses been echoed and re-echoed throughout the continent? So obviously, over and over again, there have been complaints of the opposite. So Patrick Henry made this argument, and he's saying, well, that's not what the evidence shows us. Why has our general government been so shamefully disgraced and our Constitution violated? Wherefore have laws been made to authorize a change? And wherefore are we now assembled here? So wherefore have laws been made to authorize a change? He's like, what laws have been made to authorize a change? Why are we even here? A federal government is formed for the protection of its individual members. That is a good line to remember, so I'm going to underline it. A federal government is formed for the protection of its individual members. Ours has attacked itself with impunity. So our government has attacked itself with impunity. Its authority has been disobeyed and despised. So it's basically like made itself look bad, and because of that, its authority has not even been considered an authority to listen to. So his second reason that Patrick Henry gave is that people were already at peace. There's not a problem. We're all at peace. And so he gave his evidence of why he thinks that is not true. All right, next paragraph. I think I perceive a glaring inconsistency in another of his arguments. He complains of this Constitution because it requires the consent of at least 3/4 of the states to introduce amendments which shall be necessary for the happiness of the people. In the first case, he asserts that a majority ought to have the power of altering the government when found to be inadequate to the security of public happiness. In the last case, he affirms that even 3/4 of the community have not a right to alter the government which experience has proved to be subversive of national felicity. All right, so what is he saying here? This has been shortened. We can tell because there's a ... right there. So they took some of the information out, probably because it was long-winded and unnecessary for us in order to understand the paragraph. And also might have been giving some history that we don't really need to hear. Essentially, what I can gather from this is that Patrick Henry is upset that you need 3/4 of the states to introduce amendments which shall be necessary for the happy of the people. It says in the first case he asserts. So he says at one point the majority ought to have the power to alter the government when something is inadequate. But in the last case, he says that even 3/4 of the community have not a right to alter the government. So he's pointing out his inconsistency and how in one case he says the majority should have the right. In another case, he says that's not the case. Nay, that the most necessary and urgent alterations cannot be made without the absolute unanimity of the states. Does not the 13th article of the Confederation expressly require that no alteration shall be made without the unanimous consent of all the states? Could anything in theory be more perniciously perniciously, I looked it up, it means deadly or destructive. Could anything in theory be more destructive or deadly, improvident, and injudicious than this submission of the will of the majority to the most trifling minority? Have not experience and practice actually manifested this theoretical inconvenience to be extremely impolitic? Okay, so here essentially what he's saying is we can't make it to where the states have to have the all unanimous vote on every little matter. We've seen that that's really not it's inconvenient, right? We've seen this doesn't make any sense. We don't need to have anything more. Would be deadly than to have the will of the majority to the most trifling minority. Okay, so that's how I'm reading that. If you perceive it differently, please, by all means, I'm sure there's more knowledgeable people than myself. So the third point he made here is the issue of the 3/4 support of the states. So the first issue was the apparent danger. The second issue was that people were at peace. And the third issue was his 3/4 support. And he, in each of these paragraphs, gave his reason why he thinks he's wrong. All right, next section. And then I'm going to stop this video and make another video with his response. So let's finish this last section with the last of Patrick Henry's issues. The power of raising and supporting armies is exclaimed against as dangerous and unnecessary. I wish there were no necessity of vesting this power in the general government. But suppose a foreign nation were to declare war against the United States. Must not the general legislature have the power of defending the United States? So basically, the next issue that Patrick Henry had was the power. He did not want the government to have the power to raise an army. He felt like it was dangerous and unnecessary. I mean, and you do realize the history that they're coming from is this king who, and there's also, issues in governments throughout Europe of, this tyrannical leader who has the army at his disposal to push his will upon the people. So I'm sure that's why Patrick Henry is like, nah, we don't want him to have an army. And he says, I wish there was no necessity of vesting this power in the general government. But suppose a foreign nation were to declare war against the United States. Must not the general legislature have the power of defending the United States? So he's saying if another country were to declare war, we need to enable our government to be able to respond to that and defend our country. Ought it to be known to a foreign nations that the general government of the United States of America has no power to raise and support an army, even in the utmost danger when attacked by external enemies? So he's like, do we really want foreign nations to know that the United States of America has no army to protect itself? Would not their knowledge of such a circumstance stimulate them to fall upon us? So if they know that, aren't they going to be like, oh, this is easy pickings. Let's go take care of this country over here. If, sir, Congress were not to be invested with this power, any powerful nation, prompted by ambition or avarice, will be invited by our weakness to attack us, and such an attack by disciplined veterans would certainly be attended with success, when only opposed by irregular, undisciplined militia. So essentially he's saying, we're inviting an attack from another country if we don't raise an army. And the miraculous thing that happened during the revolution was that irregular, undisciplined militia did defeat a powerful army. But can that happen repeatedly? Probably not. So he's saying we definitely need to have an army. So that means the four arguments that Patrick Henry made that he spoke against was the apparent danger of having a strong federal government, that people were at peace, that everything's going great, we don't need to change anything, everybody's happy right now. The 3/4 support that's needed in the Constitution to have a change made from the states, and then the power of raising an army. He had a problem with the power of raising an army, and in each of these instances, Madison was able to refute that argument. He explained that the truth was the danger wasn't in a strong federal government, but it was in the fractions and commotions that happen in republics because of gradual and silent encroachments of those in power. And of course, there's been a setup in this government and Constitution in order to prevent these silent encroachments. The people at peace, he's showing, no, we've had complaints. I mean, that's why we're even here, is because we have complaints of people not being at peace. The 3/4 support, he says, no, we can't have a majority. Well, one, he points out that Patrick Henry has kind of is talking out of both sides of his mouth. In one instance, he says majority. In another instance, he says the opposite. But he's saying, we can't make it be a majority for every little change. And then the power of raising an army. And he points out the obvious that I think most of us would see, that if you don't have an army, you're making yourself vulnerable to be attacked by your neighboring countries. So now we start with his opinions, his explaining of his plan for the federal government, and I'm going to make another video for that one. This is where we're going to start for here. I hope that this has been helpful as you're reading the In Favor of Federal Constitution by James Madison.